So this is a page out of my sketchbook, and some of these sketches, in fact that's the sketch from page 195, and I'm going to run you through as soon as we scan across this sketchbook page this technique, which is copic markers and Pilot High-Tech C pen. And this is the way I work a lot inside my sketchbook, so this little video is going to be about just recapping this technique. And we'll do up a similar sketch as that big sort of industrial pipeline thing out in the desert. So start with the light markers, as you've seen in quite a few of the tutorials attached to this book, but this one specifically we're going to go all the way to the finish with it and talk a little bit less about perspective, a little bit more about the media, the copic markers, and the pen. This one, by the way, is one of the ones that's been sped up. So I'm drawing here at 150% speed, so 1.5 times my normal. And what I'm doing here is just trying to block out a pipeline. I didn't want to redesign a whole thing, so it's going to be very similar and definitely inspired by the sketch out of my sketchbook that's also on the same page. So I like when I first start is, you see I threw down a horizon, then I threw down a vanishing point off there to the right, and I set up some guidelines as I'm doing right there, and I basically have a pipe coming towards us, and then it turns 90 degrees and goes parallel to the horizon line, parallel to our picture plane, and then we have an extension of that pipe that comes forward that's going to be all dilapidated and broken off. And then that pipe's been here for quite a while, so it's sitting on the ground and some sand is blown up against it. So that's what I'm doing right now, is blocking out that position on the ground, which came from my guidelines, and putting in a little bit of a slope there, and then a little bit of, industrial ooze running out of that pipeline into the foreground. And there's a couple of little blocked out pipelines way in the distance there to get some nice foreshortening. And I'm putting a little blocky kind of tower building sitting on top of that pipeline. So this is usually how it starts. Shape, and you see how much I'm worrying about perspective, which is not much. I do start to incorporate a little bit of a left vanishing point as I get a little bit over to the left side of the image. Thinking about some jet trails going through the sky just to go behind that building, help set it off from the sky. Again, when you block in with this is a cool marker. It's a C1, so 10%. And this is about the feel visually. I sometimes use the 0 if it's just sketching for myself, but on the video I need to use a 1. So, but this looks about like a 0 looks in reality when it's not on the video. So that's my block out. That took about, let's see, 9 minutes I think to do that. And 1.5. Sorry, no, a little bit quicker. Maybe, let's see, 4.5 I think. And then I'm going to go in with a Pilot High-Tech pen. And you see all the basic perspective is there, the structure is there, the proportions are there, the composition. And now I just need to go in and pick out the shapes, detail them a little bit, and refine the perspective. So next up, this is a Pilot High-Tech, what is it, a 0.25, I believe. And the other pen I use in this video is a 0.5. So I use those two quite a bit. Yeah, 0.25, which is the finest one that they make, which allows you to get a little bit of atmospheric perspective. It's still tough. This technique is great for sketchbooks because it's really minimal. You have a couple of markers, you've got pens, you don't need a sharpener. The only problem is that getting atmospheric perspective to read using this black ink technique is tricky. Because you can see this is the lightest line I can get with this pen, which is 100% black, even though it's very thin. So you try to use your lightest touch. So I usually have to sacrifice a little with this technique, the atmospheric perspective. So you see when I get a long ways away, detail out this pipeline in the distance later, you'll see that it suffers a little bit. So the easy thing to do is just scan it, and in Photoshop, just grab a big airbrush, a white airbrush, whatever's the color of your background paper, and just touch it a couple times over those pipeline positions off in the distance, and add a little bit of that atmosphere. You'll also notice that when I started my sketch, I used the marker, but I started from the background and I worked to the foreground. Right? I started with the horizon, and then I put in some guidelines, and then I laid down some of the structure, right? And then I added more and more detail, and then I switched to the pen. Now, when I'm using the pen, I started the opposite way. I start from the foreground and I work to the background. And the marker is my guide. And the reason I do that is that I'm trying to make now kind of a nicer illustration instead of a working sketch, right? The working sketch, I would just draw through everything and do an overlay to make it a nice sketch, or scan it into Photoshop and just start painting right on top of it. But in this case, what I'm trying to do is make a nice illustration. So that means fewer guidelines. All the guidelines really are only in my marker sketch, and I'm just guessing. I know where the basic grid is, and I'm trying to be aware of that. But I'm trying to pay more attention to making some nice lines that have a little wiggly kind of character that indicate this is a worn out, derelict old pipeline. And then I'm just being conscious of the perspective grid and the fundamentals, right, and everything we've explained in the book so far. And see, I find my vanishing point there, right? I found it on the right before I squiggle in those lines heading down the pipeline. And I just start to block in a little box sitting on top of this big pipe, maybe some, rust and stuff running down the side of the pipe, which makes a nice contour line. Whenever you're doing these sort of rusty old derelict thing, rust lines where water's going to rust above, something rusts out, and then it makes a nice contour line, drip line down the side. And I added a little radius to that box up top. So I used that double line technique from earlier in the book. A couple little windows. And I had another little box sticking off the backside. And you see, because I started in the foreground, right now I get all my overlapping working, and there's no lines breaking through, behind the others. So it's going to make it easier for us to understand what's in front, right, and what's behind, because I have the nice line work, okay, with my overlaps set up. I'm not really worrying about line weight yet. I'm just this is the first pass with the black ink. Again, find my vanishing point when I draw that line, and then a little quick radius and drop it down the vertical. And I'm adding an extension of these pipes coming off that building up there, and just guessing at my ellipse, the degree of my ellipse up there, because we should see it a little bit wrapping, right, because it's a little bit off our vanishing point. As it gets closer to our vanishing point, those pipes that are heading to the left, of course, those lines will become straighter and straighter, less degree. It's a little something sticking out downward off of that vertical pipe, a couple little connecting pipes. Again, it's just all makeup stuff, just sort of random derelict tech, old pipeline thing. And I don't mind doing these freehand, without the ellipse guides, without all that stuff. It gives the sketch a little bit more character. In a way, it's a lot more life. Also, it makes it feel definitely more worn out with using just freehand everything. And that connects back to some other structure behind there, so it sort of goes over there, turns, goes backwards. Putting those circles there to kind of indicate where the end of that elbow is on that plumbing. Continuing that radius on the underside of that box sticking on top. So what's going to happen next is that after the ink's dry, then we can throw some more marker over the top of it. I should say I'm working on a paper. I tried to find a paper that was similar to my sketchbook paper, which is not the best. This is just a straight up thick Bristol paper, so the marker definitely bleeds and smudges around a bit. But it has enough tooth that the black ink, once you let it dry, you can put markers back over the top, which is really nice. And one of the best things about this pen. And of course you could spend more time going in and detailing this, but I wanted to keep it, somewhat short, as it's really just about the medium, right? For this chapter, it's really about the pens and the markers and how you use them together, and then how to lay in your base sketch, work background to foreground, and then how to take the ink and work foreground to background. Okay, now I'm adding a couple of people here for scale. That makes the thing feel, now large and industrial. A couple of kind of have some hanging hoses. And I'm going to leave a little hole through here. Maybe that big pipe turns left, heads off a different direction. We can just have a little hole back out to the horizon there, just to work as a backdrop for that dark figure. And continuing this, now try to draw very lightly over here, but it's very difficult, as you can see, because every touch gets 100% black. So that pipe goes down behind this one, turns, and then it heads off to the horizon, and then we're going to pick up this other pipe heading out of frame off to the side. So I'm adding, again, kind of a similar structure that we kind of have here in the foreground, with those boxes on top, and then there's my pipeline heading off out of frame. Usually I'd darken up the border as well. I didn't bother on this one. I just tried to keep it all in frame as I was sketching, but didn't. I'd usually have a border line there. I could always add it after. And some mountains way in the distance, just a little bit above our horizon line, and a few more details, a little dome shape on top of there. And now I'm going to extend this, do the similar thing on the far side. This pipe's heading off kind of at an angle, almost parallel, and it's going to turn and head down to the horizon again. So another vanishing point as it turns, and some structure holding it up off the ground, and I know where my horizon is. Then I'm going to put up some little mountains in there. It's turning back, and hidden by the bigger pipe in the foreground. Although there is a hole through there, so I should go back and write a little, or sketch that pipe continuing. Maybe some sludge ponds out there to the left, some mountains, and put a low one just so it pokes through that hole down there. If I was going to add more value to this, that would be nice. I like those holes through these bigger structures that look way off into the distance. All right, we've got some on the right there below the pipe that's horizontal to the ground. We've got some behind the people, and then we've got some others below the structure on the left. And here I'm deciding where to put those jet trails. I just want that to help have some more organic lines up in the sky that offset the structure and the architecture of the building. And then let the ink dry a little bit. I'm going to come back and start. Yep, there's that pipe continuing. So I remembered to get it there, but I think I forgot to. When I start markering, I think I accidentally go over that, but we'll see in a minute. Okay, so next thing is let the ink dry. Think about your lighting direction. I'm going to work this with the light from the upper right and a little bit backlit, because I really want to set this hole for the big pipe in the foreground. I really want to set that into shadow. So give us a nice point of high contrast right in the foreground. So I'm using a number 2 marker now, and even though I know this is going to be much darker than a 2, I know I'm working on a paper that's very durable because it's very thick Bristol board, so I can afford to sort of flood it in there just to sort of sneak up on the marker work. Because the thing is, with working with permanent markers, when markers were invented, they took over for doing watercolor in the architectural visualization and the ad world, and graphic design and things. And the thing is, that's nice about them, they were permanent, so they drive very fast, and they're permanent. You could layer, but you can't go lighter. And you can't go lighter with watercolor either. So it's a very similar way of working. So you need to sneak up on your values basically. And I backlit this so that side of the box will be in shadow. I could only see basically 2 sides, so I see a little bit of the bottom, but wanted to be sure that I could get a nice value change, a nice form change across that corner. So I'm lifting the core shadow a little bit on these horizontal runs of the pipe because the light's a little bit behind. It's fairly vertical in the sky, but it's just right, maybe at a 15-degree angle or so. So the core shadows on the horizontal pipes that are coming towards us are a little bit below halfway, and then the ones that go horizontal, they've got to be a little bit higher because the light's behind. So you start to see that I'm still using it. This is probably now a 3. And you just work through the markers and start stepping your way up. So started with the 1 for the block out, then 2 to sort of locate my values and double check, right, that everything's working. Because even at this level with a 2, if I wanted to move my lighting, I could do it. I could relight it from the other side and still make it work, even though I'd blocked in the core shadows, because they're only a 2. So it's pretty easy to go over that and make that your brightest bright and have everything go darker. Okay, so a little cast shadow there off to the left. Again, just guessing at that stuff. So I went back and grabbed a lighter marker for that pipeline off in the distance. This is probably a 2 again for the mountains. I'm trying to set up a little value change there for the overlap. But you see, it's tough to get that atmospheric perspective to really work well. It's hard to make that look like it's a long ways away. You have to rely more on your linear perspective of your drawing than the actual value change. Okay, this is value 4. And we'll just keep stepping through until we're done. So I go back and I reinforce all the shadow areas, and then I also start to think about the value graphics. And what I mean by that is that if you have a hole on a panel that's darker than the panel itself, then you go and make that darker, of course. And so you have the surface shading, which is one value gradation, and then you have the hole itself, which is another value. Just like those could be a darker material. So you'd set your core shadow first, then you'd come back and hit the holes again, and even maybe grab a darker marker to get those to work. So it's not, so it doesn't look like it's all painted with primer gray. So you want to start to change some of the local values of, graphic areas, holes, all those things. Windows, sludge pond, right? It's maybe darker than the the color of the sand, not color, sorry, the value of the sand. And I tend to use the brush nib. When I draw the perspective in the beginning, I use the chisel point because it gives me more control to draw a straight line. And I feel that that's just more precise. But then when I start shading, I always use the brush tip. And the brush tip allows me, especially in something like this that's kind of derelict and has, it's going to have a lot of dirt and weathering on it. It helps me to create those kind of value changes. And see there, I'm changing the local color, local value of some of the graphic bits, the plugs, the holes, and that starts to give it a little bit of visual variety as opposed to all looking primer gray. And I'm going to reinforce the core shadow, leaving some pretty strong reflected light underneath there. It's not, and I was just blending that out with a 3, so I hit the core shadow first with a 5, and then I came back with a 3 to knock down the reflected light just a little bit. And I'm going to push the inside of this hole. See, I messed up right there. I cut across my nice planned pipe looking through that hole. I killed it with the value. Oh well, always fix it in Photoshop. Okay, so I'm going to like a 7 or 8 now inside as it goes deeper into that pipe. I also tried to leave a little bit of a bright spot there on the far inside surface, which was light coming through this hole on the near side, but didn't really plan it out well enough to worry about it. Okay, reinforcing my core shadow and my reflected light, some darker cast shadows. So that would be like, if you're a 3D person, that would be like working up the ambient occlusion of, right, all those shapes are sort of occluding the light from getting into the nooks and crannies, so you can go in and push the values inside those areas. So like, even though this is a ways away behind the people, there's not much light getting in there, so you could push that contrast a bit more. And we're almost at the end of this. Looks like I've got a couple minutes left. So that's basically the technique. Light marker block in, followed by and that remembers background to foreground. Then light pen, so super fine point pen, and work foreground to background to define all your shapes. Then do your marker pass to block in and get all the volumes to work after you have your composition and your shapes where you want them, which is what I just did. And now the last step is I'm coming back with my 0.5 pen, and I'm now, because this is not, it's not straight value on value to make this read, it really is a line drawing with a little bit of value, a little bit of quick value. What I really want this to be is a stronger line drawing. So what I'm doing now with a thicker pen is applying the line weight ideas that were explained earlier in the book and in a couple of videos on how to get the overlaps to work, and refining some of those edges, adding some interior details, right? And I didn't go 100% to black inside the pipe, so that allows me to quickly just drop in and still see those lines. Adding a little wall thickness to that pipe. And now we're going to get the darkest darks for my line work here in the foreground, set up some nice overlaps, the edges of the sort of, sludge rolling out of this thing, some more contour lines on the ground, some more overlaps. And that's going to really help the atmospheric perspective of those same sort of contour lines on the ground plane way in the distance. You see, I don't touch those with the heavy pen, because if I did, then they would pop way to the foreground because of the value change. So try to get a little extra detail and weight here in the foreground. And that is about it. I thought that shadow side of that blocky building was not quite dark enough. It was looking a little too light. So one more little quick pass with some value. And that's it. One of my favorite techniques, some of my favorite mediums, Copic markers, Pilot high-tech pen. Usually this is my go-to technique inside my sketchbook. So hope that helps.